My name is Dr. Shawn Healy. I'm a clinical psychologist with Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers of Massachusetts. In my work with Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers, I'm often talking to lawyers and legal professionals about their well-being. And May 3rd through the 7th, I think, is Well-Being Week in the Law. And one of the aspects of well-being that is really important and often overlooked is the importance of setting boundaries, both personally and professionally. And when I talk about boundaries, I like to distinguish the difference between a boundary and a limitation. So a limitation is a stopping point that is imposed by something or someone other than ourselves. So this could be a physical limitation, such as you're working late, you want to put more hours in, but you're exhausted, or your brain just says, good night, we're done now, and you fall asleep while you're working. It could also be an external entity saying no. So you have something in your calendar and you can't book something else, right? So that's a limitation. Something, your calendar is telling you no when you are being requested to do something else. So a limitation is, or when we work to a limitation, it is an example of something else having control over an important aspect of our lives, our time, and what we do with our time. A boundary, by comparison, or by contrast, is a self-imposed stopping point. It's when you say no, when you could say yes. It's you saying no to an opportunity or to a request when you do have the time and energy, but you're deciding to say no, and then you're going to decide what you do with your time and energy after that. When we practice setting and maintaining good boundaries, we start to feel like we have more control in our lives, in an important area of our lives, as opposed to when we don't have good boundaries, when we're living by limitation. Our yeses feel like obligations because we feel like we can't say no. I'm obligated to say yes. When we practice boundaries, we feel like we can say no. And when we do say yes, it feels like a choice. It feels like I'm choosing to say yes to this because I know I could say no. I talk about boundaries as if they're easy to set and maintain. I acknowledge that they're not always. Oftentimes they're difficult. It's challenging to set a boundary, to maintain a boundary, particularly if you don't have a habit of setting good boundaries. It's hard to start a new boundary when people are used to you saying yes to everything. So my encouragement to people is to start small, right? Identify something that you can say no to that doesn't have big consequences, and just practice saying no when you could say yes. The things that I like to warn people about or educate them about is that it is natural to feel bad when you set a boundary because you're choosing to say no when you could say yes. And oftentimes we feel bad because we're telling somebody no, particularly if that person we're saying no to is someone in need. They need our help, or they need this request filled. So saying no it just feels bad. And the person on the other side of that boundary could also feel bad being told no. And my encouragement to you is to remember that feeling, you feeling bad, that other person feeling bad, that's not a permanent feeling. It will fade. And the way that we get through that is just to maintain that boundary, to say no and to stick to it, and just watch or observe over time that bad feeling starts to fade. It starts to lessen. And the more that you practice those boundaries, the more comfortable you become setting a boundary and maintaining a boundary. One of the barriers that many people face in setting a boundary and maintaining it is they often feel like they can't set a boundary if they don't have a good enough reason or justification for that boundary. So when they think about saying no to something, they think, well, what's my reason? Do I have a good enough reason? And maybe I'm okay setting a boundary if I have a rock solid case as my reason for setting this boundary. Like, no, I'm not going to do that because, and here's my 12-point outline for how I can justify that no. My encouragement is always to start with small boundaries and to start without giving any explanation or justification for that no. Because when we practice saying no and we practice not justifying it, not providing a long list of reasons to justify our no, we start to feel like we can say no when we have a good reason, and we can say no when we just choose to say no. We're not dependent on the gravity of our case that we can build for this no. So saying no and being prepared or practicing to respond to the inevitable why, or why can't you? Why are you saying no to me? As we practice saying no and saying that's my boundary, or no, I'm not available, or it's just a no, I can help some other time, or I can offer something else, but this is a no. The more that we practice that, even though it's uncomfortable, we start to feel a little less uncomfortable as time goes on. It's also important to recognize that and expect that when we set a new boundary, it is human nature for the person or the people on the other side of that boundary to push on your boundary. We all do this. It is a way that we figure out sort of where our operating space is. So when someone sets a boundary, it's natural for us to push. Like, is this a firm boundary? Is this a flexible boundary? Is this a test? Is this a challenge? Like, am I supposed to negotiate here? So oftentimes people will push against your boundary when you first set it. And the importance of maintaining a firm boundary is paramount, because as someone pushes against it, if it's firm, they will start to adjust, right? They will start to learn that, oh, this is a firm boundary. You're not backing down. Now I need to adjust to your boundary. Whereas if someone pushes against your boundary and all of a sudden your boundary becomes flexible, then that communicates the message that, well, the boundaries are really a suggestion. I don't need to respect them as is. Maybe I can push a little bit more. And it can be helpful to interpret someone's push against your boundary just as that's human nature. It's curiosity. It's not necessarily manipulation or someone trying to push down your boundary. And when we interpret it that way, I find it easier to maintain that boundary without resentment for that push on the other side. The more that we practice making a boundary and maintaining them, we start to feel like we have more control in our lives. And when we think about the consequences of poor boundaries or the lack of boundaries, at the heart of that, like I said, when we're living to the point of a limitation, we're giving control over to something or someone else. And when we look at stress in our professional work, the jobs that we have that are the most stressful are the jobs that we feel the least amount of control in. And as we feel more control in our stressful environments, we feel more resilient. We feel like we can navigate that stress better. We feel like we have more agency in our decisions. And overall, we're able to navigate that better. We're able to prevent burnout, because at the heart of burnout is this sense of a lack of control. I'm trying really hard and I'm not able to make this thing happen. And so exercising control, reminding ourselves that we do have control in certain areas of our lives is really important. And boundaries is a great way to exercise that control. Now, I often get questions such as, a boundary would be great, but there's consequences to saying no. I can't just tell my boss no, like this is an obligation that I'm responsible for. And so it's helpful to not just be on one side or the other of that continuum of I'm going to say no to everything versus I can say no to nothing. So there's somewhere in between those where you can exercise that control and exercise boundaries. So if there are things that you would like to say no to, but you can't because there's consequences, you'd get fired, you'd lose clients, what have you. Look for ways that you can establish boundaries that are less consequential, that don't have those consequences or potential consequences. So if you can't say no to a request from your boss, can you exercise a boundary in terms of the timeline or the expectation or navigating, what else you have on your plate? So my encouragement is to think of ways, creative ways where you can establish boundaries, even smaller ones, to help you feel like you are exercising control in a healthy way, in a way that protects yourself and allows you to navigate your time better. At the same time as realizing that there are limitations to our ability to say no to everything that we don't want. That's just the reality of our work. So my encouragement to you is go forth, set boundaries, practice maintaining them, wait out that discomfort when you're setting a boundary, because it will go down. And the more that you practice, the easier it becomes. It might not ever become truly easy, but it will become easier as you practice. So be well. Thanks.